of a wonderful drip, 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 and then this year a splash of TFN support with a really nice, quite fat grant of £25,000 to deliver some progress on our campaign to use shareholder power to make companies, FTSE 100 companies, very large publicly listed companies, become living wage employers in their UK operations. So I'm going to mainly talk about that, but just thought maybe mention that I am also a member of TFN and have gone to not very many, but a couple of events where I wasn't actually presenting. Went to the one with Daniel Craig, and actually he was far less impressive than the TFN presenters with their charities, particularly Reprieve, who were gobsmackingly brilliant on the evening and who I was more than delighted to support, as well as other people, I think, that night. So I think it's great the way you get your donors to also be recipients and vice versa. It's very good. People in the charitable sector should be charitable, I think. Yeah. So FairPensions, which is actually going to be changing its name soon to slightly more reflect how central shareholder activism is to our work as opposed to the fairness of pensions. But that's coming up, and I won't divulge yet what our new name will be, but look out for our new identity soon. So we are a campaigning charity that focuses on what happens in the, to most people, very mysterious world of professional investment, and tries to encourage major powerful investors, particularly pension funds, but also the very large fund managers that look after the money of pension funds, which is looking after all of our money if any of us have any kind of pension savings, to use their very significant potential influence on companies to encourage responsible company behaviour, long-termist company thinking, and as well as sort of trying to monitor and benchmark and scrutinise the professional investment world. We, for example, do regular rankings of how the biggest players in the investment world perform on responsible investment, and that's very useful for getting a bit of positive competition into that sector through on the things that we think are important. But we also run these single issue campaigns where we raise something we think is important, like living wage standards in the UK economy, and we try to encourage big companies and their investors to really get behind a push. So I had personally a long history of involvement with the living wage movement in the UK, having previously been a community organiser and been involved in starting in 2001 a living wage campaign, or the living wage campaign, in the East End of London, in hospitals, but also in big banks at Canary Wharf. And the living wage campaign has got more and more profile and prominence, which is wonderful. And there have been some tremendously important breakthroughs and victories at some very big employers in the public and private sector, and some big charities jumping on board as well, which is great. People like Oxfam have crept towards, and I think now are a living wage employer.
You mean they weren't?
Well, you know, this is what I mean about charitable sector being charitable. We've got to get our house in order sometimes. But But the reality was, with the living wage movement, that although there were these kind of bright sparks and really significant victories, and we had the really great thing that had been achieved a few years ago was we had won the argument that actually a major company could take responsibility for ensuring that its lowest paid staff and the cleaners who worked for contract companies that came in and did the work, often at night time in their buildings, should actually get a wage that was a decency level, enough to live on, as opposed to the minimum wage. We'd won that argument. The reality is we hadn't really got living wage standards to penetrate right through the economy, and we still haven't. Very far from it. Low pay is a huge problem in the UK economy, and wage disparities and inequalities have grown fairly relentlessly for a long period. And to change that and transform that requires a very well coordinated strategy that takes on power at the centre in the financial system. So that's what we've been trying to do, both by making the case to very big investors like the city fund management firms that they should get behind our cause, but also going directly to companies, and particularly by buying shares, just one or two, in FTSE 100 companies and popping up at their AGMs. And that has been, slightly to my surprise, a really remarkably productive strategy. And it turns out that when you go to an AGM and you very politely point out that the people that are sitting on the stage have done tremendously well for themselves, not always as well for their shareholders, it must be said, and that the people that work at the very bottom have often been forgotten about completely, it does resonate quite powerfully. Now, some directors don't give a monkey's, but the many company directors are actually people of very good conscience. They care about their company and the people that work for it. They care about the reputation of their company, and asking a question in that public way has really got us into some really terrific dialogue with very big companies. And our plan this year is that we're going to go to 50 AGMs of large companies. And sometimes we'll be going to very publicly say, thank you for becoming a living wage employer. We've secured some new wins in the last few months. But most of the time we'll be going along because we're still don't have a majority of those companies committed to the living wage. Hello. Hello. We'll be going along to nudge them further. So just to get a flavour of who we're actually talking to at the moment, one of the things we like to do is pick off companies that are slightly in competition with each other. So there's two big property companies in the FTSE 100, Land Securities and British Land. And both of them at the moment are edging towards full total commitment on living wage. They've implemented it for a lot of their smart London office developments. They have still not got over the line in terms of their shopping centres, which is another part of their business empire. But the fact that they know we're talking to each other, and the fact that they know that we're going to be popping up again at their AGM this year, is moving both of them closer and closer to where we want to get to. So one of the lessons coming out of this work at the moment is we need to take advantage of some quite useful rivalries between companies that are in the same sector in the FTSE 100. The other really important lesson that's come out of talking to these different companies is that you do need to find, and you can make real progress when you find some individuals and you start dealing with individuals who genuinely really care about this issue, and there are quite a lot of those people dotted around the high places of the corporate world. So a good example of that would be Whitbread, which owns Costa Coffee and Premier Inn hotel chain. We haven't got there with them yet, but they really want to make it happen. They would be a hugely important victory if we could get them, because most of the original wins in the living wage movement were in the finance sector, where, relatively speaking, it's quite cheap to introduce the living wage because most people are not paid at a very low rate of pay. Having said that, getting Barclays and HSBC on board, which we achieved last year, resulted in about 5,000 people moving up to the living wage, so very meaningful. Most of those were the people that work for those banks in their branches, employed by contractors doing cleaning and catering and security work and so on, as opposed to directly by the bank. But even directly by the bank, there are a few below the living wage and they're now above the line. But what we wanted to do with the TFN grant was really break beyond the finance sector. So we've got a big focus at the moment on the pharmaceutical sector, where we're hoping that that kind of useful rivalry between GSK, AstraZeneca and Smith & Nephew, who are three of the big names in pharmaceuticals in the FTSE 100. All of those three companies are talking to us. Bit more pressure needed though. So this is where the strategy of going to the big investors is so crucial, and a new cluster of allies that's emerging are the local government pension schemes in the UK. So local government itself is largely not living wage compliant in the UK, but there are a number of pioneering councils and local authorities around the UK who are really committing to living wage. Islington Council is one example of that. Very strong commitment to Islington to become a living wage employer. And the finance, the councillor who's responsible for finance, who also chairs their pensions committee and is therefore a powerful investor, is doing some joined up thinking on this, and now he's really kind of getting behind our shareholder push. So it's about, what we're trying to do at the moment is make useful links. One of the links is, once we've got a company on board, you encourage them to be an advocate with other companies. So we had a meeting last week with Johnson Matthey, which is a big engineering firm that make catalytic converters. And along to that meeting came the Director of Procurement of Aviva PLC. Aviva have become a living wage employer, and he came along to tell his story about what they've done at Aviva and why Johnson Matthey should do it. So there's this nice sort of momentum building up where once people have become a living wage employer, they generally, we find that they've become quite, well, certain individuals who've really helped to make it happen in their company become quite passionate about it, and they then become wonderful, better than we are really, advocates for doing it at other big companies. So the sector that would be amazing, but I think we're a long way from at the moment, is supermarkets. Having said that, we had a very positive meeting with Morrison's in late 2012. Then unfortunately they had disastrous Christmas results, and they've been in the papers week after week for doing really badly compared to their peers. So I sense that we're going to slide back a bit with Morrison's. The reality is, with all of these campaigns with each individual company, it depends a bit on where they're at, what pressures they're under at the moment. As in all endeavours in life, it's all a bit unpredictable, but that's partly what makes it very interesting. Okay, so just in terms of the kind of whole prominence of living wage, I don't know if anyone noticed the first living wage week, which was in November of last year, and have you sort of got a sense of living wage popping up a bit more in the public space? Yeah. Well, Living Wage Week, we were very involved in sort of devising it, and we held a big event in Aviva Investors to invite companies and investors to learn more about the living wage concept, which was a very productive event, led to lots of meetings with people. And I feel that our kind of original concept, which is we want living wage to become something that any major company in Britain, or especially publicly listed company on the stock exchange, that wants to call itself a socially responsible company and a socially responsible corporate citizen, just really does need to be on the bandwagon on living wage. Whereas at the moment, there's lots of companies like BT that are very, very hot on CSR and promote themselves in that way, but they're not yet living wage. So it's kind of, we won't get to every single company, there's 100 of them out there. We've got about 10 or 11 under our belt already, but we won't get to everybody, but if we could kind of, through this campaign and with your TFN support, kind of get over that point where every company needs to have at least a response or an answer, and be able to, and that shareholders expect to put that on the agenda. Now, a potentially very promising thing which has happened, we've been talking for a long time to Legal and General insurers. And one of the reasons we were so interested in them is that Legal and General, a division of the company, is Legal and General Investment Management. And we knew that there were people in there who were really keen to use their shareholder voice, which is they're the biggest fund manager in Britain, to raise this issue with companies. But until their own parent company had kind of got its house in order, very tricky, to be honest, for the chaps in, the team, the corporate governance team, as they call themselves, at Legal and General Investment Management. But we have had a breakthrough, not totally public, so please keep that to yourselves, but we've had a breakthrough, and so that is going to unlock, I hope, Legal and General Investment Management being a very strong advocate, because we know the people in there would like to be. So we're making some headway. We're halfway through your grant, and I'm going to just say a tiny little bit about the other things we're doing, unless, because it's not our only project, and I thought it might be a chance to just flag up a couple of other campaigns and issues we're working on. But does anyone have any question before I do that, while I draw breath and have a sip of tea, about the living wage work?
Could you speak a little bit to what living wage is, what is, and what it is that the campaign is doing with it?
So the living wage, there's two rates of pay for the living wage. There's one in London, because London living costs are so high, and it's £8.55 per hour. And there's one outside of London, which is £7.45 per hour. Contrast that with the minimum wage of £6.19. Makes a very big difference to people who have that rate of pay during the whole working week. And creating the living wage figure is based on research into what level of nutrition do people need, what level of basic housing, what does it cost in London to keep body and soul together in a way that has some modicum of decency without requiring a 65-hour week of work. And the origins of the campaign are groups, community groups in East London, observing that people were working such long hours to survive, and that was having huge costs on family life, wider community life, that things were just really out of balance. But to meet those living costs in London required very long hours of work. So the living wage campaign is an attempt to restore to people the dignity of just being able to work a normal number of hours per week and still be able to afford the basics. I have to say it's a really very modest and conservative calculation of what it really costs to live. Most of us would find that basically impossible. But many more, thousands of people are now on that rate of pay. It makes the evidence coming through from them is that makes a real big difference. And also, what's been great about the living wage campaign and the whole movement is that it's also about trying to recognise and acknowledge people at the very base of the employment pyramid who are often very invisible. And I think one of the things that's quite important about this campaign is it makes the high-ups think about the people at the very base. And when you've got in these huge companies these kind of complex remuneration committees that spend weeks and months thinking about complex bonus arrangements, people at the top, to have to focus a little bit of attention and put a little bit of money towards people at the very bottom is sort of, I think, something very, can't quite articulate why, but I think that's very important for companies to have to do.